Welcome to your recap video on pedigrees. Okay, so first up, what do we actually mean by a pedigree? Well, a pedigree is where we're looking at a specific trait or condition that is genetically passed on. Okay, so it's a lineage for traits and conditions. Now, this could be inherited conditions and diseases such as our haemophilia that we've already looked at, and that's cystic fibrosis. It could also, in agriculture, be used in terms of breeding stock and characteristics in specific livestock or crops. Also within agriculture, if we're looking at disease resistance and certain crop features, okay? So the whole idea of following pedigrees is really quite important. However, it is a tricky thing to get our heads around. So let's start at the beginning, okay? Now, we've already studied quite a bit about genetics, and we've said that traits can be inherited. They're inherited via the genes or alleles. Okay, now we've spoke about karyotypes. Okay, and here we can see the human karyotype. Okay, and we know we've got 23 pairs of chromosomes. In a karyotype, they're arranged from the largest chromosomes at number 1 right through to the smallest chromosomes at 22. Now, 1 to 22 are all what we call those autosomal chromosomes. So they are all pairs, identical pairs, okay? Now, they have identical genes on each chromosome, remembering that if the gene has a different instruction, so for example, you've got a gene for hair color, and one gene may be for black hair and one gene may be for red hair, then the difference, we call them alleles. So they're both genes for the trait, but because there's the difference, we're calling them alleles, okay? All right, our 23rd pair in the human karyotype is our sex chromosome. So we can have XX for the female or XY for the male. We've also looked at the fact that traits can be dominant or recessive. And when we look at genotypes, we know that those capital letters, so if you've got a BB for a trait, then you've got two dominant Bs, two dominant traits of the B. If you had a big B and a little b, then your capital B is the dominant trait and your lowercase b is your recessive trait. Alrighty, so we've talked about these pedigrees, okay, and sometimes they're called pedigree keys. Okay, we've got some interesting information here. Basically, a pedigree is a bit like family tree, but when we're looking in genetic terms, we're looking at how a trait gets passed on. Okay, but if you know anything about family tree, it's very similar. We've got some important features. First up, down the side here in Roman numerals, we've got the generation. Okay, so the first generation is the grandparents there at the top in this case. That could be great-grandparents, it could be great-great-grandparents, but generation 1 will be the first generation at the top that you see. Don't be fooled, I just said at the top. You could end up seeing a key that's laid out differently. You need to look for generation 1. Generation 2 is a generation that follows on from generation 1, and then you get generation 3, which is the generation that follows on from generation 2. All right, we've got some family members that we need to have a look at. So, for example, if that green arrow is pointing to the individual that we're talking about, say that's you, then here we've got your mother and father, and these are your grandparents. Okay, so the youngest generation is always the bigger number on the generations as such. So when I'm saying bigger generation, the youngest generation here is generation 3. Alrighty, what do all these lines mean? The horizontal line between two of the individuals, that's what we call the marriage line. Then the vertical line coming down from a marriage line, that's showing the offspring. And then that horizontal line connecting offspring shows siblings, so brothers and sisters. Also note here, circles are females, squares are males, and generally we will look this is slightly different, this one, but generally, if one of the shapes is filled in with a certain colour, then we say it is the affected one. So it's got the trait that we're looking at. Sometimes not, sometimes, so for example, in this one, it's different colours. You need to find the key and you need to look at the key and see what you're reading from that diagram. Okay, so how do we interpret a pedigree? Let's have a look at this one. Looks a little bit more complicated. How many generations have we got? We've got 1, 2, 3, 4 generations. Okay, we've got some marriage lines here. So we've got the great grandparents, then we've got the grandparents. This one we'll say these are the grandparents because they link to this line. So we've got some grandparents, then we've got parents, then we've got the final generation. Okay, so what is this pedigree showing us? All right, we're looking at a certain trait here. All right, and we know the grandmother was affected, well, it's actually the great grandmother. Okay, the great grandmother was affected by whatever condition. Okay, because the key tells us affected female. So this isn't quite correct here because it's the great grandmother. It's X-linked because both males and females exhibit this condition. Now, if only the males exhibited it, it would be a bit different. We'll look at that with haemophilia. Okay, so if it was a Y-linked disease, then it would only, or condition, you'd only see that in the males. But also recessive X conditions could be seen. Okay, but we know that this is definitely X-linked. Because both males and females inhibit it. It appears to be a dominant trait. Okay, so there's no evidence of it being recessive. If we look over here, so look here first, we've got a male that's affected, and then we've got a female and a male offspring that's affected. If we look over here, we've got 2 recessive and none of the, or 2 either non-affected or recessive, and none of the offspring have got it. So by this diagram, we would say it's probably dominant. Okay, so interpreting our pedigrees. Now, let's have a look at this one. What have we got? This is an interesting one. We've got so we've got the individual, parents, great grandparents, great great grandparents. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 generations that we're looking at. Alrighty, so what have we got? What does it show us? We're looking at 2 trees. We've got great great grandparents, great great grandparents, and then the marriage line that's joining us is there. Okay, so we're looking at 2 trees joined by marriage. Both sets of paternal great great grandparents, I keep missing greats out, great great grandparents, okay, have got this condition. So both paternal, remembering paternal is another word for male, have got the condition. It's X-linked because it's passed to males and females. And this proves to us that it's recessive. Individuals here have got it, yet one of their offspring have it. Okay, so it shows that it is recessive because it's passed on from 2 carriers in generation 2. Okay, what are we looking at here? Have a look, see what you can think about this one. Okay, well, it's Y-linked, we would say, because the evidence shows that it's only expressed in the males, or it could be recessive on the X and none of the females here, but we're not seeing any carriers. We've got no symbol to show a carrier. So in that respect, we would say it's most probably Y-linked. Okay, let's have a look at haemophilia. Now, remember, haemophilia is an X-linked recessive condition. So if we're looking at this, we're going to use little h as the haemophilia allele okay, and big H as the non-haemophilia allele. So a female without the haemophilia trait is written as XX, so XX because she's a female. And then we've got those capital H's there because H is the non-haemophilia allele. A female who is a carrier, she has the big H and the little h because the little h is a haemophilia allele. So to be a carrier, you've got to have one of the alleles. You just don't exhibit the trait. A female with the haemophilia trait, so she actually exhibits haemophilia, she has haemophilia, is written your capital X, and your two little h's. A male without haemophilia would, because remember this is only on the X-linked chromosome, without haemophilia would be an X with a capital H and then a Y because it doesn't affect the Y. A male with haemophilia would be written as an X with a lowercase h and then his Y. Okay, now Queen Victoria, she was a haemophilia carrier, okay, and you can see the royal tree from Queen Victoria here, showing who ended up carriers and who actually ended up suffering from haemophilia. You can see that it's nearly always men who contract haemophilia, but women are often carriers. Okay, and that's because of that fact that for a woman to have haemophilia, she needs to have two recessive haemophilia chromosomes on the X, which means both her mother and her father must be carriers or have haemophilia. Okay, so the case of two parents having haemophilia or being carriers is actually quite rare. So that's why not so many women have haemophilia. So you can see that a lot more men have haemophilia and lots of females carry it. Okay, the line that the Queen comes from is actually Edward here. Okay, so Edward wasn't infected, so the current Queen doesn't have haemophilia. All right, or isn't a carrier because it didn't pass any further on. But some of Queen Victoria's offspring have. Okay, now looking at those questions that you had in your booklet. Okay, so the first question, consider the following pedigree for 3 generations of a family. The shaded squares show those individuals who have inherited a particular trait or characteristic. The characteristic is not sex-linked. So that's the first thing we know. It's not sex-linked. So it's not linked to the X or Y chromosome, so it's autosomal. How is person 5, let's find person 5, and person 9 related? Well, person 9 is male and has married a sibling, so that would be a brother-in-law. Okay, what relation is person 8, where's person 8 there? Person 8 to person 13. Alrighty, so, well, if that's person 13's father, and number 8 and number 4 are siblings, that would make number 8 an aunt. Okay, is this trait dominant or recessive? Justify your answer. Can we tell at this stage whether it's dominant or recessive? No. How about over here? Can we tell if it's dominant or recessive? No, because it's been passed on to offspring. We don't know. It's over here that answers that question. We've got 2 parents that do not have the condition. However, we get an offspring who does have the condition. So both of these must be carriers, which means the trait is recessive. Now, it's asking you to justify your answer. So the recessive because, oops, I can't spell, 8 and 9 are carriers proven by 14 being affected or exhibiting the trait. All right, identify those who are definitely carriers of the gene for this trait and who are not affected. Okay, so let's have a think about this. Person number 1 will be a carrier because we know it's recessive. Okay, so to have offspring that have got it, they have to be carriers. Again, number 3 is recessive because to have the offspring, they must be carriers. Number 5, because both parents are recessive, has got to have it. Number 6, same reason. Number 8, we know is a carrier. Number 9, we know is a carrier. Number 11, both parents carry it or have it. So number 11 must be a carrier. Number 13, and of course, number 15. So because it's recessive, and for the offspring to exhibit it, everyone who doesn't actually exhibit the trait must be carriers. All right, the following pedigree shows the inheritance of cystic fibrosis. The shaded individuals have the disease. Is the gene for cystic fibrosis likely to be dominant or recessive based on this pedigree? These guys have got it, okay, but the parents do not have it, which means it must be recessive. Okay, the parents do not exhibit the condition, but some offspring have got it. The same's happening down here with 12 and 13, so it must be recessive. Some individuals are carriers of the gene, but do not have the disease. Identify the individuals who are carriers. Okay, so we know that 1 and 2 are carriers. Okay, now 17's got it, so we know that 12 and 13 must be carriers for 17 to get it. Okay, now for that to have happened, for 13 to have it, then one would expect that 7 definitely inherited it from their parents. Sorry, 12. Yeah, just thinking that through out loud. We don't know about 14 because we don't know about their offspring yet. And because we ended up with 1 offspring actually having it, we know that number 12 must have had it. Alrighty, B. That's what we just did. Now let me just write them in so you can double check. So 1, 2, 7, 12, and 13. Okay, C. If individuals 12 and 13 have more children, what is the chance that any future child will have cystic fibrosis? And you need to justify your response. Okay, so let's have a look at 12 and 13. Now, in terms of 12 and 13, because they're carriers, they will be heterozygous, yeah? Because if they had 2 recessive genes, they would have the condition. If they had 2 dominant genes, they would not have the condition. So they're heterozygous. And therefore, because of that, there is a 1 in 4 chance of their offspring having cystic fibrosis, okay? So if you think about that, say we go for capital F, little f, capital F, little f. They're carriers, so they're heterozygous, so we could have no condition whatsoever, carrier has the condition, okay? So a 1 in 4 chance, 25% chance that the offspring will have cystic fibrosis because they are heterozygous. Okay, question 3. This is a pedigree showing a family tree with Huntington's disease. Huntington's disease is an inherited disease that causes certain nerve cells in the brain to waste away. People are born with the defective gene, but symptoms don't usually appear until middle age. Early symptoms of HD may include uncontrolled movements, clumsiness, or balance problems. Later, HD can take away the ability to walk, talk, or swallow and leads to an early death. List the members of the family above who are afflicted with Huntington's disease. So you'd say number 1. So you say generation 1. Just see how this is written, okay? Because we've got quite a few number 1. So we've got to say generation 1, 1. Okay, then in generation 2, we've got number 2, number 3, and number 7. And then in generation 3, we've got number 3. Okay, so we're looking at, if they've got Huntington's, it's a filled in shape. There are no carriers for Huntington's disease. You either have it or you don't. With this in mind, do you think that Huntington's is dominant or recessive? It is dominant, okay, because you either have it or you don't. So only one copy of that allele, the capital H, is required to have Huntington's. Oops, I can't spell again. Dominant, you know what I mean? Okay, C. How many children did individual generation 1 and generation 2? So how many children did these guys have? Okay, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, remembering this one and this one are married into it. So 6. D. How many girls did generation 2, number 1 and number 2 have? How many offspring were female? 2. 1 male. How many offspring have Huntington's? So that was off of these 2. It was carrying on from the last question. How many from these 2 have Huntington's disease? 1. Describe the gender and disease status of generation 1, person 2, and generation 3, person 5. So we say generation 1, 2 is female and non-affected. We actually say normal in that respect. So not affected, okay? And then generation 3, number 5, is male and also not affected. Hope that helped with your understanding of pedigrees.